The officer's cruelty. The summer evening settled over the city like a heavy, humid blanket. The scent of asphalt baked by the sun still lingered in the air, mixing with the distant aroma of street food from a nearby block. The streetlights flickered to life, casting long shadows over the cracked pavement, and the sounds of the neighborhood. A car honking, a couple arguing in the distance, the rhythmic thump of a basketball bouncing against the sidewalk blended into an urban symphony. For 12-year-old Jaden Carter, this was the time of day when the world felt different, quieter, like it was holding its breath. His sneakers scuffed the pavement as he walked, his backpack slung over one shoulder, and in his hands, he clutched a book close to his chest. It wasn't just any book, it was Voices of Justice, Civil Rights Movements in America, a book he had spent hours reading at the local library, his personal sanctuary. Jaden had always been different from the other kids in his neighborhood. While most of them spent their evenings playing video games or hanging out at the park, he preferred to read. He devoured stories of heroes, men and women who had stood against injustice, who had fought for what was right, even when the world was against them. His father, Edward Carter, had always taught him the importance of standing firm, of using knowledge as his greatest weapon. Edward Carter was no ordinary man. He was the city's mayor, a man respected and feared in equal measure. He was known for his strict policies, his relentless pursuit of justice, and his unshakable moral compass. He had built a reputation as a leader who did not tolerate corruption or discrimination. But with great respect came great scrutiny, and as his only son, Jaden constantly felt the weight of expectations pressing down on him. Tonight, though, Jaden wasn't thinking about politics or his father's influence. He was simply walking home, lost in thoughts about the stories he had just read. That was when he heard it, the low, rumbling engine of a police car. Jaden didn't react at first. The sound of patrol cars was nothing new in his neighborhood, but when he saw the flashing blue lights reflecting off a nearby store window, his stomach tightened. He picked up his pace slightly, his heart thumping in his chest. The police cruiser rolled up beside him and came to a slow stop. The doors creaked open, and out stepped two officers. The first officer was Larry Hudson, a broad-shouldered man with a square jaw and eyes that carried no warmth. He moved with the confidence of someone who knew he had power, and he wore a smirk that sent a chill down Jaden's spine. Hudson had a reputation, a man who saw himself as above the law, a bully with a badge. People in the neighborhood spoke his name in hushed tones, their voices tinged with fear. The second officer, Ryan Adams, was younger and less sure of himself. He had an uneasy energy, shifting on his feet like he didn't belong. "Hey, kid," Hudson's voice cut through the night air, sharp and commanding. "What are you doing out here?" Jaden stopped in his tracks, his grip tightening around his book. He turned slowly to face them, his eyes meeting Hudson's cold gaze. "Just walking home, sir." "From the library," Jaden answered, keeping his voice steady. Hudson stepped closer, his boots clanking against the pavement. He glanced at the book in Jaden's hands and snatched it before the boy could react. "Library, huh?" Hudson scoffed as he flipped through the pages. His expression darkened. "And what's a kid like you doing with a book like this?" Jaden swallowed hard. "It's for school," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Hudson's smirk grew wider. "A history project, huh? Or maybe you're planning something else." Jaden felt his heart pounding. He knew what this was. He had seen it happen before, to his friends, to other kids in the neighborhood. Harassment, intimidation, humiliation. Hudson tossed the book to the ground and motioned toward Jaden's backpack. "Let me see that bag." Jaden hesitated. His father had always told him to be respectful, to comply with officers, but there was something in Hudson's eyes that made his skin crawl. He glanced at Officer Adams, hoping for some reason, some decency, but the younger officer looked away, avoiding his gaze. "I said, let me see the bag." Hudson's voice was sharper this time. With trembling hands, Jaden handed it over. Hudson unzipped the bag and turned it upside down, dumping everything onto the sidewalk. His pencils, notebook, water bottle, and a crumpled granola bar wrapper scattered across the pavement. Hudson nudged the items with his boot, as if expecting to find something criminal. Then he picked up Jaden's notebook and flipped through it. His sneer deepened. "What's this? Plans for a revolution?" Jaden shook his head quickly. "No, sir. They're just notes for my history class." Hudson's face twisted with amusement, but there was something darker underneath. "You seem awfully nervous for someone just coming home from the library. You got something to hide." "No, sir." "You sure?" Hudson took a step closer, looming over him. "Because you know what happens to kids who lie to the police, don't you?" Jaden felt his breath hitch in his throat. The air felt heavier, the streetlights harsher. And then it happened. Hudson grabbed Jaden by the collar and dragged him toward the alleyway. Jaden gasped, struggling, but the officer was too strong. The younger officer shifted uncomfortably, glancing around as if hoping no one was watching. Then, in one swift motion, Hudson lifted Jaden off the ground and threw him into a large metal trash can. The world tilted. Jaden landed with a hard thud, the stench of rotten food and decay assaulting his senses. His book landed beside him, its pages now stained with filth. Laughter. Hudson's deep, cruel laughter echoed in his ears. Jaden's heart pounded as he tried to climb out, his hands slipping against the greasy metal. The humiliation burned hotter than the summer air. Hudson stood over him, his hands on his hips. "That's where you belong, kid. In the garbage, just like the rest of you punks." Jaden looked up, his face red with anger, embarrassment, and fear. A group of people had gathered now, watching, but no one moved to help. Then Hudson said something that made Jaden's blood turn cold. "What's your name, boy?" Jaden clenched his fists. He didn't want to tell them. But then he heard a voice from the crowd whisper, "That's Jaden Carter, the mayor's son." Silence. Hudson's face paled. The smirk vanished. His hands trembled. And then his knees buckled. He stumbled back. He blinked rapidly, his breathing growing shallow. Then, with a gasp, Officer Hudson fainted. Jaden pulled himself out of the trash can, standing tall as the entire world seemed to shift around him. Everything had just changed. The aftermath of humiliation. The world around Jaden Carter had changed in an instant. Just seconds ago, he had been nothing more than a boy. A black boy humiliated and discarded like trash by Officer Larry Hudson. But now, as the officer's body hit the pavement, unconscious, the crowd that had formed in the dimly lit street grew restless. Gasps filled the air. Phones came out, cameras flashing. Whispers of disbelief spread like wildfire. Did he just say Carter? Like Mayor Carter? That's his son. Oh my God. Jaden pulled himself out of the filthy trash can, his heart pounding, his body trembling. His hands, slick with the grime of rotting food, clenched into fists. His book, once a symbol of knowledge and power, was now soaked in the filth of his disgrace. His father's name had hit Officer Hudson like a bullet. The once arrogant man, who had stood over Jaden like a god of judgment, had collapsed into a heap of weakness. Fear had taken him. The weight of his actions had crushed him. But for Jaden, there was no justice in this moment. The garbage was still on his skin. The humiliation still burned in his chest. The second officer, Ryan Adams, moved quickly to check on his fallen partner. He knelt beside Hudson, slapping his face gently. "Hudson, Hudson, wake up, man." Nothing. Officer Adams looked up at Jaden, his expression shifting from nervous unease to outright panic. He realized what had just happened, not just that Hudson had assaulted a child, but that he had assaulted the mayor's son. Jaden took a slow, shaky step forward, wiping the grime from his face with his sleeve. The crowd around them had only grown. Their whispers had turned into murmurs, their murmurs into anger. "Somebody call the mayor." A woman shouted. "No need." Another man muttered. He's gonna find out real soon. And that was the truth. Jaden could already imagine it, the moment his father would hear what had happened. Edward Carter was not just a leader. He was a man of absolute authority. He didn't just speak about justice. He enforced it. Hudson had made the biggest mistake of his life. A night that would never be forgotten. A few minutes passed. The tension in the air thickened. Hudson remained unconscious, his breath shallow. Officer Adams finally stood up, his eyes darting between Jaden and the watching crowd. "Everyone needs to clear the area," Adams said, though his voice lacked conviction. He wasn't in control anymore. The people were. No one moved. The crowd had been silent victims of Hudson's tyranny for too long. They had seen him bully, intimidate, and abuse his power without consequence. Tonight, however, they had seen something different. They had seen fear consume the monster. A man in a worn-out construction vest took a step forward. His voice was steady but filled with fury. "You gonna arrest your partner? Or do we need to call someone who will?" Adams licked his lips, his face pale. Hudson didn't mean. "Oh, he meant every damn thing he did," the man interrupted. "And you just stood there and let it happen." Jaden remained still, his blood boiling. Officer Adams opened his mouth again, but before he could say another word, a powerful voice cut through the air. "Jaden." The crowd parted like the Red Sea, and there he was. Edward Carter. The mayor arrives. Jaden had seen his father angry before. He had seen him deliver powerful speeches, call out corruption, and battle against injustice. But he had never seen him like this. Edward Carter was a force of nature. At 6'3", with broad shoulders and a commanding presence, he didn't need to yell to make an impact. His tailored navy suit and red tie were immaculate. But his face was carved from stone. His eyes locked onto Jaden. For a moment, his expression softened. His son, his only son, was covered in filth. His dignity had been dragged through the mud. Then his gaze shifted and landed on Hudson. Officer Adams, visibly sweating now, took a nervous step forward. "Mayor Carter." "Sir." Edward raised his hand. Silence fell instantly. He turned to his son. "Jaden," he said, his voice calm but heavy. "Are you hurt?" Jaden wanted to say no. He wanted to say he was fine. But his throat was tight, his hands were shaking, and his heart was still pounding from the terror of being thrown away like garbage. Finally, he whispered, "No, sir." Edward nodded. Then he looked at Hudson's crumpled body on the ground. "Who did this?" It wasn't a question, it was a demand. Before Jaden could speak, a dozen voices from the crowd answered for him. "Officer Hudson." He threw the boy in the trash can, humiliated him, bullied him, laughed while doing it. Edward turned to Adams. "Is this true?" Officer Adams froze. He looked down at his unconscious partner, then back at the mayor. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. Edward took a step forward, not aggressively, but with a weight that made the younger officer stiffen like a cadet before a general. "You had two choices tonight, Officer Adams," the mayor said. His voice was low, steady, and dangerous. "You could have stopped this. You could have done what was right. But instead, you let it happen. That makes you just as guilty." Adams visibly swallowed. "Sir, save it." The mayor turned, looking at the crowd. Then he did something unexpected. He stepped aside and motioned for his son to step forward. Jaden hesitated. His father nodded firmly. And in that moment, Jaden understood. His father wasn't just here to save him. He was here to teach him something. Justice wasn't about words. It was about action. With every eye watching, Jaden walked past his father and stood in front of Hudson's fallen body. He looked down at the man who had just thrown him away like he was nothing. And then he spoke. "Officer Hudson." Silence. "You put me in that trash can because you thought I didn't matter." Jaden's voice was strong, unwavering. "You laughed at me, humiliated me. And now that you know my name, you're the one lying on the ground." More silence. Then Jaden turned to Officer Adams. "And you," he said. "You could have stopped him, but you were too afraid." Adams hung his head. Jaden finally turned to his father. "What happens now?" Edward Carter didn't even blink. "They will face justice. Every single one of them." And with those words, the night that had begun in shame became the night that changed everything. The weight of justice. The night air grew thick with tension as the crowd surrounding Jaden and his father held its breath. The once confident Officer Hudson lay on the ground, his body twitching slightly as he began to stir. Officer Adams stood frozen, his face pale with fear. The street was no longer just a quiet neighborhood. It had become a battleground for justice. Jaden could still feel the filth clinging to his skin, the sticky residue of humiliation staining his hands and clothes. He wanted to scrub it away, to erase the memory of being tossed away like garbage. But deep down, he knew this moment was bigger than him. His father, Mayor Edward Carter, stood beside him like a pillar of unshakable strength. His suit was crisp, his expression unreadable. But Jaden knew his father well enough to see what boiled beneath the surface. Controlled fury, a storm waiting to be unleashed. Officer Hudson groaned, his eyelids fluttering as he came to. He lifted his head slightly, his face contorted with confusion. Then he saw the crowd, and then he saw Edward Carter. Panic flashed in Hudson's eyes as he scrambled to sit up, looking around as though he had awoken in a nightmare. His hand shook as he realized where he was, on the cold pavement, surrounded by the very people he had spent years intimidating. Oh God. His voice was hoarse. Slowly, Hudson tried to push himself up, but before he could get to his feet, a pair of polished leather shoes stepped into his vision. Edward Carter. Hudson's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. His usual bravado was gone, replaced with the pale horror of a man who had made the gravest mistake of his life. The mayor's voice was a low, deadly growl. "Do you have anything to say, Officer Hudson?" Hudson swallowed hard. His hands trembled. He had faced down criminals, gang leaders, and riots before, but none of those things compared to the cold, piercing stare of Edward Carter. "Sir, Hudson's voice cracked. I didn't know." Edward tilted his head slightly. "Didn't know what?" Hudson's Adam's apple bobbed. "Didn't know that was your son." The words had barely left his mouth before the crowd erupted. Shouts of anger, disbelief, fury. Oh, so if he wasn't the mayor's son, it would have been fine. How many kids has he done this to? You only care now because you got caught. Hudson flinched as if struck. He turned back to Edward, his desperation growing. "Sir, please. It was a mistake. I wasn't thinking." Edward's face remained unreadable. But then he took a slow step forward. Hudson scrambled backward, his hands raised as if to shield himself. He looked up at the mayor, eyes wide with terror. "You weren't thinking." Edward's voice was low, controlled. "Let me tell you what I think, Officer Hudson." Hudson gulped. Edward leaned in slightly. His voice didn't rise, yet every word carried the weight of a final verdict. "You are a disgrace to the badge you wear." Hudson visibly shrank. "You represent everything that poisons this system." His breath came faster. "And you will answer for what you have done." Then Edward turned to Officer Adams. Unlike Hudson, Adams had remained frozen in place, his face glistening with nervous sweat. His hands clenched and unclenched, as if he wanted to disappear into the pavement. "You," Edward said, his tone unwavering. "You had a choice tonight. A choice to be better, to do the right thing. But you stood there, silent, while your partner abused his power." Adams looked at the ground, shame coloring his face. I didn't," he stammered. "I wasn't." "No," Edward cut him off. "You weren't. and that makes you just as guilty." Adams closed his eyes for a brief moment, swallowing his regret. Then, without hesitation, Edward reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone and dialed. "Chief, it's me." His voice was smooth but firm. "I need internal affairs down here immediately. 2 officers, one for assault, the other for neglect of duty." Hudson let out a strangled gasp. "Wait. No, sir, please." Edward ignored him. "Yes, I expect them in 10 minutes, and I want this handled by the book. No cover-ups, no delays." He hung up. Hudson looked like he was about to collapse again. Please," he stammered. "Please, sir, you can't do this." Edward's eyes darkened. "You did this to yourself." The power of the people. The crowd had grown larger now. More people had gathered, their eyes wide as they watched something they had never seen before. A police officer, a man who had spent years harassing their community, was finally being held accountable. Somewhere in the crowd, a voice called out, "Justice." It was a single word, a whisper. But then another voice joined, and another. And then it wasn't a whisper anymore. "Justice, justice, justice." The chant swelled, growing louder, vibrating through the streets. For once, the people weren't afraid. For once, the law was working for them, not against them. Jaden stood tall beside his father, looking at the man who had tried to break him. Hudson, who had mocked him, thrown him into the trash, who had laughed as if Jaden's dignity was worthless, now sat in the dirt, awaiting his fate. And it felt right. It felt like something inside Jaden had changed forever. A new path forward. As the flashing lights of police cruisers filled the street, Jaden turned to his father. Edward placed a strong hand on his son's shoulder. "Are you ready?" the mayor asked. Jaden frowned. "Ready for what?" Edward gave him a knowing look. "To start making the difference." Jaden looked at the crowd, at the people cheering, at the officers standing frozen, at the cameras recording everything. Then he thought about the book he had been carrying, the book that had inspired him to stand for justice. He had read about heroes who changed the world. Tonight, he realized he could become one of them. And as he nodded to his father, he knew that this was only the beginning. The rise of a voice, the rhythmic chant of justice, justice, echoed through the streets, carried by the voices of a community that had long suffered in silence. Tonight was different. Tonight, they were no longer afraid. Jaden Carter stood beside his father, Mayor Edward Carter, as the flashing red and blue lights of approaching police units painted the street in a chaotic dance of color. Hudson, the disgraced officer who had humiliated Jaden, sat slumped on the pavement, his breathing shallow, his eyes darting in panic between the angry crowd and the man who held his fate in his hands. Edward had made the call. Internal Affairs was on its way, and when they arrived, they would find not just a complaint, but an entire community ready to testify. Jaden clenched his fists, feeling the weight of the moment. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was bigger. As he scanned the faces around him, he saw something in their eyes: hope, determination, the possibility of change. And it terrified the officers still standing among them. The fear of the system. Officer Ryan Adams, who had watched everything unfold, stood stiffly by his partner. His uniform, usually a symbol of authority, now felt like a heavy weight on his chest. His hands fidgeted. His breath came fast. He had spent years believing that silence was protection, but tonight, it was his sentence. Edward turned to him, his gaze sharp. "Do you understand what you did tonight, Officer Adams?" Adams hesitated. No excuses." Edward's voice was like a hammer striking steel. "You stood by and let it happen. You watched as Hudson threw my son into a trash can, and you did nothing." Adams swallowed. "I was scared. He's my superior officer. You were scared." Edward's tone darkened. "A 12-year-old boy was thrown into garbage like he was nothing, and you were scared." Adams looked down, shame burning his face. The crowd didn't let him escape accountability. You stood there and let it happen. You're just as bad as he is. Adams's lips trembled as he saw the people closing in, their rage palpable. His badge, his uniform, things that once made him powerful, were now a source of shame. Edward let the moment sink in before speaking again. You don't deserve that badge. Adams exhaled shakily. He looked at Hudson, the man who had led him down this path, who had poisoned his sense of right and wrong. Slowly, Adams reached up and did something unexpected. He unclipped his badge and set it on the pavement. The crowd went silent. Then he unhooked his gun belt and placed it beside the badge. He took a step back, his hands up in surrender. I won't fight it, he whispered. For the first time that night, Jaden saw true remorse in someone's eyes. Internal Affairs arrives. It wasn't long before the sleek black sedans of Internal Affairs rolled onto the street. A team of serious-looking officers stepped out, their expressions cold, methodical. These weren't the everyday patrol cops. Their presence alone demanded respect. Jaden had never seen police officers fear other police officers before. But Hudson was shaking. One of the IA officers, a tall black man with graying hair and a calm but firm demeanor, walked directly up to Edward Carter. Mayor, the man greeted with a nod. Chief Daniels. Edward nodded in return. I trust you got my message. Daniels turned his gaze to Hudson, who looked like a cornered animal. Then his eyes flickered to Adams, who had already surrendered his badge. Daniels sighed. This one, too. Edward folded his arms. He stood by and let it happen. Daniels nodded. We'll handle it from here. Hudson finally found his voice. Wait. You can't do this. It was a mistake. I didn't know who he was. Daniels arched an eyebrow. Oh, so if it was another black boy, just one without connections, it would have been fine. Hudson froze. Daniels scoffed. That's what I thought. Then, without further words, he nodded to his officers, and Hudson was placed in handcuffs. The crowd erupted in cheers. For the first time, in a long time, they saw justice. Jaden watched as Hudson was escorted to one of the Internal Affairs vehicles. The once feared officer was now a prisoner of his own actions. And Jaden, he felt something stirring deep inside him. A purpose. Jaden's decision. As the IA officers began questioning witnesses, Edward Carter turned to his son. You did well tonight, Edward said. Jaden looked up at his father. What happens next? Edward exhaled. The city will talk about this for weeks. People will demand answers. Hudson will lose his job, possibly face charges. Adams, well, he'll have to live with the choices he made. But what about everyone else? Jaden gestured to the crowd. They've been dealing with guys like Hudson for years. What happens to them? Edward studied his son carefully. Jaden wasn't just asking about this night. He was thinking ahead, thinking about the system. And that's when Edward saw it, the spark of a leader. That depends on you, Edward said. Jaden frowned. Me? Edward nodded. You stood up tonight. You didn't back down. That means something. But if you really want to change things, you have to keep going. Jaden thought about the book that had started it all, about the civil rights leaders he had read about the way they had never stopped fighting. Maybe his father was right. Maybe tonight wasn't the end. Maybe it was the beginning. Jaden took a deep breath. Then I want to help. I want to fight for change. I want to make sure what happened to me never happens to another kid. Edward smiled, pride glimmering in his eyes. Then let's get to work. The morning headlines. By the time dawn broke over the city, the incident had already made national news. Mayors is as on humaniatd police officiers unendur investigation. Internal affairs OPNs TAC into CYSTEMICABUSE force. 12-year-old JADEN Cartier. He case. OUT. This is ABOT more than me. Pictures of Jaden standing defiantly in front of Hudson's unconscious body spread like wildfire. Video footage of the incident went viral, sparking conversations across the country. But the most powerful moment, the interview Jaden gave the next morning. Sitting across from a well-known journalist, dressed in a clean suit his father had bought him, Jaden spoke clearly, calmly, and with a passion that shook the nation. "This isn't just about me," Jaden said into the camera. "It's about every kid who's been mistreated, bullied, and thrown away. People like Hudson think they can do whatever they want, but we won't let them." The interviewer nodded. "So what's next for you, Jaden?" Jaden's jaw tightened. "I'm going to fight back. I'm going to stand up for kids like me. I won't stop until this city and this country sees real change." And with those words, a movement was born. A movement begins. The morning after the incident, the city awoke to something different. A shift in the air, a ripple in the system that had long held people in fear. Every news channel ran the footage on repeat. The world had seen it. The police officer who had humiliated and thrown a 12-year-old boy into a trash can had collapsed from sheer panic after learning who the boy's father was. But the real shockwave wasn't just about Hudson's downfall. It was about Jaden Carter's voice. People weren't just talking about what happened. They were talking about what Jaden said in his interview. "This isn't just about me. It's about every kid who's been mistreated, bullied, and thrown away. People like Hudson think they can do whatever they want, but we won't let them." Those words weren't just replayed. They became a rallying cry. And soon, Jaden's face, still young but filled with fierce determination, became a symbol of something far bigger than himself. The school awakens. When Jaden walked into school the next morning, he expected the usual routine. Teachers acting distant, kids whispering behind his back. He had never been the most popular kid, not because people didn't like him, but because he was different. He was the kid who read too much, who asked too many questions, who refused to just go along with things. But today, everything was different. From the moment he stepped through the entrance, all eyes were on him. At first, it made his stomach tighten. Was he about to get made fun of? Were people going to call him weak for what had happened? Then, a kid, one he barely even knew, stepped in front of him and nodded. "Respect, bro." Jaden blinked. "What?" Another kid, a freshman with curly hair, walked past and clapped him on the back. "You stood up to a cop, man. You got guts." By the time he reached his locker, a group of kids was already gathered around. Some of them had never spoken to him before. Now they looked at him like he was something more. "Yo, Jaden, that speech you gave, that was real, man. You gonna start something, like a movement. You should run for class president or something." Jaden felt a strange mix of emotions. He had spent so much of his life trying to live up to the expectations that came with being Mayor Carter's son. But now, people weren't looking at him because of his father. They were looking at him because of what he had done. And for the first time, he felt like his voice actually mattered. A meeting with the mayor. That night, Jaden found himself sitting across from his father in the mayor's office. It wasn't the first time he had been there, but tonight it felt different. The air was heavy with unspoken things. His father sat behind his desk, hands folded, watching him carefully. The strong, powerful mayor, who had never once backed down from a fight, looked proud. "You've done something remarkable, Jaden," Edward finally said. Jaden shifted in his seat. "I wasn't trying to." Edward smiled slightly. "That's the best kind of leadership, the kind that happens when someone speaks their truth." He leaned forward. "Now tell me, son, what do you want to do next?" Jaden hesitated. The truth was, he didn't know. Or at least, he hadn't known until today. until he walked into school and saw the way people looked at him, until he realized that maybe, just maybe, he could do more than just speak. He could lead. "I want to help," Jaden said, his voice steady. "I want to make sure what happened to me never happens to another kid." Edward nodded, his expression unreadable. Then, to Jaden's surprise, he reached into his desk drawer and pulled out a file. He slid it across the desk. Jaden picked it up and opened it. Inside were documents, reports, cases of other kids who had been harassed, bullied, and mistreated by law enforcement. "This isn't just about one bad cop, Jaden," Edward said. "It's about an entire system that allows men like Hudson to exist." Jaden's fingers tightened around the papers. So many names. So many kids like him. "This city is at a breaking point," his father continued. "People are ready to listen. But they need a voice." Jaden looked up. "And you think I should be that voice?" Edward smiled. "I don't think, son. I know. The first rally. It started with a simple idea. A small gathering in the community center. A place for people to talk about what happened. But word spread like wildfire. By the time Jaden arrived that weekend, there were over 500 people waiting outside. He had never seen anything like it. Kids, parents, elders, people of all backgrounds, all colors, standing together. Some held signs. Others had shirts with his words printed on them. "We won't let them." Jaden stood at the front of the room, his heart pounding in his chest. He had never given a speech before. But as he looked out at all these people, something inside him clicked. He wasn't just a boy who had been thrown into a trash can anymore. He was something more. And so he took a deep breath, grabbed the microphone, and spoke. "Thank you all for being here," he began. His voice was steady, stronger than he expected. "I didn't ask for this, but neither did any of you." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. What happened to me was wrong. But it's not just about me. It's about all of us. The kids who are afraid to walk home at night. The families who don't know if their loved ones will make it back. The people who have been ignored, silenced, and treated like they don't matter. A few claps, nods, encouraging shouts. Jaden gripped the microphone tighter. "But that ends now." A wave of applause swept through the room. "We are not trash. We are not disposable. And we will not be silent." The crowd roared. Jaden Carter, the boy who had been thrown away, had found his purpose. And the city would never be the same again. The revolution begins. The night after the first rally, Jaden Carter sat in his bedroom, staring at the ceiling. His mind raced with everything that had happened, the faces in the crowd, the voices cheering his name, the powerful realization that people weren't just listening. They were waiting for change. The city, the country, the world, they had seen what happened. They had witnessed the humiliation, the fall of Officer Hudson, the fear in the system that had once been untouchable. And now, people weren't just talking. They were ready to act. Jaden wasn't just a boy anymore. He was a movement. And that meant he couldn't stop now. The birth of Project Justice. The next morning, Jaden sat across from his father in the mayor's office, the same place where everything had changed just days before. But this time, they weren't here to talk about what happened. They were here to talk about what would come next. "We can't let this die out," Jaden said, his voice firm. "If we just let this be another viral moment, then nothing changes." Edward Carter leaned back in his chair, nodding slightly. "You're right." Jaden took a deep breath. "Then I want to do something real. Not just speeches, not just rallies. I want to make real change." Edward folded his hands. "What are you thinking?" Jaden sat forward. "Project Justice." His father raised an eyebrow. "A program for kids who have been victims of police violence," Jaden continued. "A way to protect them, teach them their rights, and give them the power to stand up for themselves. And not just kids, families too." Edward's expression was unreadable, but Jaden saw the fire in his father's eyes. "It won't be easy," Edward warned. Jaden smiled. "Nothing worth doing ever is." Edward let out a low chuckle. "You really are my son." The resistance from the system. It didn't take long for Project Justice to spread. By the end of the week, the program had already gained national attention. Jaden's speeches were being played on TV. His words were being shared on social media. People were rallying behind him. But with attention came opposition. It started with threats, anonymous calls, messages telling him to stop before he got himself in trouble. Then, the police union made a statement, a cold official response claiming that the incident with Officer Hudson had been blown out of proportion and that Jaden's words were dangerous. And then came the attempt to silence him. One morning, as Jaden walked to school, a black SUV pulled up beside him. A man in a suit stepped out. "Get in the car, kid," the man said. Jaden didn't move. His heartbeat quickened. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice steady. The man smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "A friend. Someone who thinks you're getting a little too loud." Jaden clenched his fists. "So what? You're here to scare me." The man sighed, stepping closer. "Listen, Jaden, you're young. You've got your whole life ahead of you. But if you keep pushing like this, things might get complicated." Jaden's stomach twisted. He knew what this was. A warning. A threat. He thought about running. He thought about shouting for help. But then, something inside him hardened. Fear had no power over him anymore. Jaden took a slow step forward, looking the man dead in the eyes. "You can tell whoever sent you that I'm not stopping," Jaden said. "And if they try to come after me, I'll make sure the whole world knows about it." The man's expression faltered for just a second. And in that moment, Jaden knew he had won. The man exhaled sharply. "You're making a mistake, kid." Jaden smirked. "No, you are." And with that, the man got back into the SUV. And Jaden watched as the car disappeared down the street. They were afraid. And that meant he was doing something right. The moment that changed everything. The next rally was bigger than anyone expected. Thousands of people flooded the streets, marching with signs that bore Jaden's words. "We won't let them." Jaden stood on a raised platform, microphone in hand, looking out over the crowd. He could barely process how many people were here. They were fighting. Together. He took a deep breath. And then he spoke. "They tried to silence me. They tried to scare me. But I am not afraid." The crowd roared. "They threw me away like garbage because they thought my life didn't matter. But today we stand here, together, to say that all of our lives matter." The cheers were deafening. "This isn't just about me. It's about every kid who has been treated like they're nothing. It's about every family who has suffered in silence. And today we are silent, more." The energy was electric. Jaden felt tears in his eyes as he looked out at the thousands of people standing with him. His words weren't just words anymore. They were a movement. And he was leading a revolution. The final stand. In the months that followed, Project Justice grew beyond anything Jaden could have imagined. Laws were challenged. Corrupt officers were exposed. Kids who had been mistreated finally had a voice. And through it all, Jaden never stopped. He didn't stop when they tried to silence him. He didn't stop when they tried to scare him. He didn't stop when they told him he was just a kid. Because Jaden Carter knew one thing for sure. A kid can change the world. Epilogue. A future unwritten. Years later, the history books would write about the night that changed everything. They would write about the boy who was thrown into the trash. They would write about the officer who lost everything. And they would write about the movement that was born from it. But more than anything, they would write about a boy named Jaden Carter, the boy who refused to be silent, the boy who sparked a revolution, and the boy who, in the face of injustice, stood tall and said, We won't let them.